Okay, so welcome to the talk about Cypress, using it together with Playwright. We will discuss afterwards what this really means. For now, let me quickly introduce myself. So I'm Rainer. I'm working at Angular Architects, so giving their training, consulting, and that stuff. And among all the workshops that we have, we also have a workshop for testing, and there we are using Cypress. So that's more or less my connection to this talk and to that topic here as well. I also have a channel on YouTube. I have also created Engine News. This is fairly new. There I just publish a video every week, exactly on Monday. It lasts just 100 seconds, and it's just what has happened in the Angular ecosystem last week. So if you're interested in that, if you want to be up to date all the time, this might be a very good idea. There exists no internet, no homepage at the moment. You can just follow it on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, wherever. Okay, so enough about the advertising. Now about the actual topic. So before we really start, I have to say a few words. It is very important that the things that I'm going to show, you have to be in a position like this. So you have to be already very desperate. You should have already tried everything out, which is possible. And if you have no other choice, then maybe this is something that you can use. And this talk is about one of the limitations or constraints that we have in Cypress. So in Cypress, when we have a test and inside of the test, we are switching to another domain, super domain, then we have a problem because Cypress doesn't support this at the moment. And then depending on what you're trying to do, you might have some kind of problems. And what I'm going to show you is where you can use Playwright. So what you're doing is that you write this a normal Cypress test. When it comes to switching to another super domain, Playwright takes over, is doing whatever is required, and then it gives the control back to Cypress, and Cypress just continues normally. That talk itself about the agenda, we have just two parts, very simple. We have the introduction first. This is more about the theory, and then the major part will definitely be the live coding. So I will show you how to do this actually. Yeah, let's start. Maybe what is a super domain? That's not the real technical term, but that's the one that you find in the Cypress documentation all over. Actually, the real technical term would be same origin principle. So what this means is that as long as the protocol, the host name, and the port stays the same, we don't have any problem. As soon as that changes, we have the use case that we have a switch in the super domain, and that's where the troubles then really begin. Subdomains are, of course, excluded. Subdomains are allowed. So if we have here a www or something else, and we just change that part, Cypress doesn't have a problem with that. And the same is true, of course, also for the path. So that's it for the beginning, that we all know about what we are talking here. Now, with switching super domains, there are three different use case types, if you want to say so. The first type is, I think, quite common. This is when we want actually to test the switch to a super domain. This means that inside of our application, we are doing some parts, and then we expect or we want to assert that maybe a link appears, and we want to verify that this links really to another domain, for example. It can also be the case that we have a network redirection, so that this is not just a link, but that something inside of our application starts to navigate our user to somewhere else. The second type, the single switch, is what we are actually focusing here. This is when we say inside of our application, inside of our test, we need to switch to an external service, can be or through service, as it will be the case, or something else, because we require some data from there. And only if we have that data can we continue. And so there is just one single switch, and then we just are back in our application and can continue. And then we have the third one, which is, in my opinion, a very rare use case. To be honest, I've never seen it live, but I've heard that it exists. So this is when you want to test a complete application landscape. I just made up that term, but the point here is that in one test, for some reason, you need to switch between domains multiple times. This is, of course, I would say the worst case scenario, and we will now discuss each of them in a little bit more in detail. So this is here the first one. This is where we say, okay, at the end of our test, we are redirecting the user to some external application. What you can do here is also very well described in the official documentation of Cypress, where they say, just try to avoid to run the last step, just stop at the last green dot that you see here. And if it is a link, so if you have a normal A tag that has some kind of href, then don't click on the link, just verify that the A link has the href attribute set to wherever you want the user. If you're doing redirection, it's a little bit more tricky. If you can, a good strategy could be that you say, okay, there is some kind of service somewhere in my JavaScript code, I'm triggering the redirection. If you can, you might come up with some kind of feature toggle or parameter context setting where you say, look, I'm now in the testing environment, so don't do the real redirection, just emit a signal, an event, something that Cypress can be notified. And then Cypress knows, okay, now this would have been the place where the redirection takes place. I can also check the URL, and if it's the right one, then I'm happy. If, as we will see, the redirection will happen with because of a third-party library that you are using, then it will be a little bit harder, maybe even impossible. There is a video at the end of the slides in the further reading. There you see a video from Gleb where he shows how you can override the window location replace command, which is a very hackish approach. But if it works, and as I said in the beginning, if you have already tried all other options, then maybe that's the one that you can really use. So that's the first use case. Now we don't need Playwright for that right now. We skip the second one because we will focus on that afterwards. I just want to go to the extreme one where we have really multiple switches. Although it is theoretically possible to do it with Playwright or to do it with another approach, I would recommend that when you really need to write such a test at this moment, and maybe as hard as it might sound, and maybe Cypress might not be the end-to-end framework you want to use, maybe you want to switch, but this is also just a question of time, because Cypress is, of course, at the moment working on that. So you can expect that some time in the future, it might work. But as I said, this is a very rare use case, so let's not bother with that one. And then we have the single switch. So this is the use case that we will focus on. And here we say, okay, we have a test. We need to send the user to some OAuth 2 provider that the user authenticates, is navigated back, and then we just continue with the test. So how can we solve that? No, we don't start with Playwright. What we first should do, that you should look if there exists a plugin for that, for an OAuth 2 provider. Chances are quite high that there exists such a thing, and then you just use the plugin and just, yeah, and you can be happy, more or less. If there is no plugin, or maybe you have some other external application, doesn't have to be OAuth 2, can be something else. What you cannot then also do is that you can try to analyze the HTTP communication that would go on, and you are replaying that communication with cy request. So what you're doing actually is that instead that you're navigating your user to that external service, that you're using cy request, direct HTTP communication with that external application. You're sending some request, you're getting some response back, and that's what you're using in your test. Your test doesn't have to leave your application. That's it. If you don't find a plugin, and if it is for some reason or for whatever reason not possible to use cy request, then you are running out of options. And maybe it is time that you take a look at that, you consider using an end-to-end tool, another end-to-end tool like Playwright, or what is also possible, what I will also show just very quickly, because maybe that's not the best option. You can also disable the Chrome Web Security. So when you're doing that, it will also work, but you have to be aware that you have just disabled the complete security feature of Chrome. Okay. Why Playwright? Why that approach? Are there some advantages? Of course, as I said, yes, if you don't have no other choice, but maybe you have a plugin, maybe you would have the time to analyze all the HTTP traffic that is required. There might be some arguments where you still say, okay, although I know I can use a plugin, I still go with the Playwright approach. What you always have to consider with the HTTP communication, it might be a little bit hard, or might be even very hard to find out what type of communication is required. I mean, you have to remember, you have to know the request type, what you need to pack into the body. You also need to know what you are becoming back from the external service. Maybe it's not just a single HTTP request, but multiple ones. So this can take a lot of time to implement that. If you're using a plugin, then it depends on the plugin itself, who has written that plugin. If you have a plugin which is maintained by a single person, you have to be a little bit careful, because are you sure that you're getting support if something does not work? Are you sure that the person will maintain the plugin? So let's say that the OAuth service gets an upgrade, maybe the communication works. Will that single person also update it in half a year or so? This is always something that you have to keep in mind. If you say, okay, I don't want to take the risk to rely on a single maintainer plugin, or it is just too complex, it just takes too much time to re-implement the HTTP communication, what my third-party library would do, then you might say, okay, maybe I want to use Playwright or some other end-to-end testing tool. So because it might be a little bit easier if I just navigate or use an end-to-end testing tool to navigate to the external service. I just enter some data which is required there, and then I'm done. There is a risk, of course. You are fully depending now on the UI of that external service, and this can mean that it changes. It can change on a daily basis. It can change when your tests are running at this very moment. Then it's not so good. Or of course, it can also happen that it doesn't change in a year or something like this. The point is, you don't know. So that's the risk that you have to take. As soon as this external service changes its UI, you have to update your tests. But what you have instead, the big advantage is, of course, it's now your code. It's now under your full control. So if you say this is a requirement like OAuth 2, I really need to have that under my control. When something changes, I need to be able to make the fixes very quickly, because all my tests will not work anymore. And maybe this is a valid argument. So, and why Playwright? Why did I pick Playwright? Actually, there's no particular reason. If you have expertise, knowledge in some other end-to-end tools that can do switching between multiple domains, then just use them. The pattern that I will show you can be applied to any other end-to-end tool as well. So if you're good in Puppeteer or WebDriver.io or something else, just use it. I have to say, I tried it with Puppeteer before. It didn't really work. It kind of felt a little bit like Selenium, but as far as I know, that's not, we can't blame Puppeteer for that. It's just the lack of my experience. I know from many people that they're using Puppeteer quite successful, and that it really works. Yeah, but what can I say from my experience? I then just tried it out with Playwright, and it just worked out of the box. So that's why I stayed with Playwright in this context. Okay. So that's for the first part. That's for the theory. And now I will show you how we can use Playwright to do an auth2 authentication and to write a test with that. Before I do that, maybe I show you the application itself. Where do we have it? So this is a very simple application. It just has a sign in button and nothing else. So when I click here on sign in, I'm navigated to some Azure OAuth2 service. I need to sign in. When the sign in works, I'm redirected back and I'm getting here the message, welcome. Now I want to do this sign in process with Playwright. So there we are. Okay, so now coding time. The background shows already the final solution. So if everything breaks, we need to use this code that you see here. Okay, I have already prepared a test for that. So this is my init spec. And what I'm doing here is that I am trying to run the test of the application that you have just seen with normal Cypress commands. Cypress is also opened. So just that we see it once, how it looks like when it fails. I click on this test. Somewhere a browser should open. Wonderful. The page opens. We have our sign in button. We just clicked on it. And then on the left side, we see already the error message telling us that there is now this problem of a super domain. And that's why it's not working. So I'm quickly closing Cypress. And because what I will do now is that I can show you how it would look like if we are running Cypress with Chrome Web Security set to false. In this context, it would actually work. So if I say watch insecure, Cypress will open just normally, but now the test will work. Okay. So I'm just running this for the sake of completeness, that we have once seen that it works if we are disabling Chrome Web Security. So you see, everything looks a little bit normal. I had to do some tweaks in terms of fetching the URL. Nevertheless, the test says that the login was successful. Okay, but we don't want to disable security. That's why I'm ending Cypress now, and we will never run this script again. Instead, I will do the following. I will start now to write a Playwright script, a simple Playwright script that just is doing the authentication. I'm not starting with the integration into Cypress yet. I just start with the script. For that, I create in the plugins file or wherever you want, I create a new file that I call Playwright login. I have already prepared some boilerplate code. So this is how a Playwright test would look like. We have here a lot of async commands. What we're saying here, we are launching a new browser. In this case, it's Chromium, which is not headless, so that we can see what it is doing. We are opening a new page, and we just say, okay, I go to the page localhost 3000. And if we want to run the script, I'll create another file, which I just call login.ts. What this file is doing, it's importing the login function from Playwright, and inside of an asynchronous function, it is calling it. So I say here login, of course, await. And I also need to call the function immediately. I have already prepared a script to run this file. So this is here with TS node. And if I do that, we should see that a browser opens with our application, but nothing else. The next steps will start afterwards. So this is how it looks like. browser is opening, we see the sign in button. Very good. So what I have to do now, that I can use my existing Cypress script. I mean, I see here already all the commands, the password, the username, everything. And I just need to rewrite these few lines in Cypress, in Playwright. There we are. So maybe here in await. Then what do we say? We want to click on a button. So that's done with that one. I mean, the selectors, they are not good ones. I think this goes without discussion, but just for the sake of demonstration, I'm using a very simple one. So we have the logon identifier. That's our first input that we have already in our OAuth 2 service. So I say here the username is John Doe. Then we have the password field where I say this is Fupu, strange password. Then we just click again on a button with ID next. And then we can say we would expect that we are then redirected back, and there should be some paragraph showing that tells welcome. So I say page wait for selector. In this case, that's that command. And I can use text equals welcome. So this would be more or less the equivalent of a contains in Cypress. Let me quickly check. I think that looks right. No, that looks right. Let's just run it. So everything works. We should see the login, of course, and coming back to our page that tells welcome. Okay, so we have here was quite fast, but this is what we wanted. So now we do have a script in Playwright, which is doing the login. And what we have to do now is that we have to kind of integrate that script or the data that we have received from our OAuth 2 service into Cypress. The way how usually these third-party libraries with OAuth 2 work, they're storing some kind of data inside of the local storage, maybe session storage, maybe something normal cookies isn't important here. But what we have to do is that we just take everything that is inside of this Chromium browser and move it into Cypress. I will only move the part which is inside of the local storage. So I have already prepared here a script. This is that one. So what we're doing here is that we say, I mean, this is one of the big differences between Playwright and Cypress. The code here isn't run inside of the browser, just outside. We're here really remotely controlling the browser. So whenever we want to run a script inside of the browser itself, we need to run page evaluate. And this is code that runs inside of the browser. It's a little bit complicated. So we say window. What I'm doing here is that I'm just fetching everything which is in the local storage of window. I don't have to care what keys are there. This is an implementation detail of my library. I just take everything that I have and return it. And since we are using here TypeScript, I will not just return it like this, but I will create an interface for that so that it looks a little bit better. So I say we have a login response, and this just has one property, which is the local storage. And that's the type for it. And here in my await, I need to say, okay, I store this under the variable local storage. That's what I require. And I'm returning an object literal with local storage. What else am I missing? Promise login response. Okay. That's it. Last test before we really implement that into Cypress. So what I'm going to do, that I just say, okay, I have here my local storage. I store the response here as well, and I'm just printing it out to my console. If that works, I am done. Hopefully it works, because that's always the risk with live coding. Yep, looks good. So here in our console, we see all the stuff that is part of our local storage. And actually, we have now finished the hardest, the longest step of our implementation, namely to come up with a Playwright script. The next step is that we need to integrate that into Cypress. So that we need to transfer the local storage data. The way how this works is that the Playwright script should run in the Node.js process of Cypress. So we don't want to run the Playwright script inside of the browser, will not work. So that's why we run it inside of the Node.js process. If we want to do that, then we need to write a cy task for that, because the cy task can then be used by the test itself. So the test is triggering the Playwright script, and it waits until the script returns the local storage. And that's what I'm going to do. So I go back into my end-to-end test now in Cypress. I can already say I want to skip that part, because that was the old one with disabled Chrome security. I don't want to run that test anymore. And I say I have a new test. It should log in. And now I need to have the task, of course. And in order to create the task, it's very simple. I just open my plugins file. Here I have my on property. And what do I have to do? Well, I just say I want to register tasks. And now I need to pass an object literal that contains the names of my tasks. That's very clear. So I have here a login task. And I say, as soon as this task is called, I want that you are executing this login script inside of your Node.js process. We don't need to make it so complicated, because the login keyword is the same as the function. So we can also write it like this. Okay. So now we have a task which is called login. When we call that, we should see that Playwright is doing the authentication. And of course, what we are going to do is that we are transferring then the local storage. So let me quickly insert the task script here. This is how it looks like. So we are running the login task. We are waiting for the response, and there we're getting the local storage. And then we are just writing that local storage that we have received from Playwright into our browser that runs actually the test. We have to do this, of course, before we're opening, or before we are entering our application, because as soon as we enter our application, the application expects that there is already something in the local storage. Otherwise, it might get a little bit confused. Okay, so where are we? So I say cy visit. And if this is successful, then I can actually copy and paste the assertion that I have from my older test and say, when I'm entering the website, I should be authenticated and I should see the welcome in the paragraph. Let's see if it works. Yeah, maybe I should also start Cypress again. So I say test watch. Yeah, and I forgot to disable the, so to set the headless mode to true. That's why I expect that Playwright will open a browser. Let's see. Okay, so it works. We see here Playwright in action. It opens another browser window. We should hide that, of course. But in the end, we see in Cypress itself that it really says, okay, you are signed in. I have everything that I require, and I could continue with whatever I want to test. So that's it already for the integration. The next step is the performance boost. with cy.session. The problem, what we have right now is the following. If we look at this test, it takes 9 and a little bit more seconds. The problem is I need to do this authentication every time. And if I say every time, I require at least 9 seconds. That's way too much. So we need to improve that a little bit. Let me show you. So if I say, okay, I have another test that says it should also be logged in, that for some reason thinks that we have already authenticated before. So why shouldn't we be authenticated a second time? Let me just remove the headless and set it to true. So I'm storing that one. And if the test runs, we should see that the second test will fail because it isn't logged in. That's the problem. And for that, we have quite a new addition in Cypress, which is the cy.session command that provides some kind of a cache that is taking all the session, the local storage data, storing it, and every time we are requesting that session, it injects it into another test. And that's what we can use here. So, and I will not continue like calling the cy task here inside of our test. I will create a command for that, which is doing this, is of course much better. And I will also apply the session in the command there. So the commands should be common. So I say I want to have a new command. This is a login function returning void, returning nothing. And I add a new command to Cypress, login. What is this doing? Well, I just need to copy the cy task that I have here, paste it, and I have to apply now the cy.session command. And the way how cy.session works is that we have to provide some kind of session key, caching key, and the function that should be executed when the cache is empty. And this is a function that I just need to wrap over the cy task that I'm running here. I say the cache key should be login. Of course, this can be parameterized. So if I say I'm using multiple users, then I can also add this here as well. But inside, we are just running the cy task. I have to be careful with the parentheses. And now I have a command login, which is using the session as cache and is calling internally the login itself. Let's see if that works. So I need to go to my login here. I tried for the first test only. So I say here cy login. There we are. What changes now is that we have here this addition of session, and it tells us, well, I don't have anything in the cache yet, so I need to run the script that you have provided me for the first time. Of course, the second test fails. This was actually our intention. But what we see now, please mind the time, 13 seconds. If I rerun the test, then it's already over. You see here that it says, okay, I have already something inside of my session. I'm using that, and the test was done more or less immediately. And now I apply the same session to the second test so that that one is also logged in. And of course, I'm not doing this with cy login, cy visit, but I just create a before each method. And there I say, yeah, please run the login command, open the web page, and everything should be fine. Store it, run it, done. Below 1 second, we have 2 tests. Everybody is authenticated. We have a cached session, and well, we have a fully logged in user. The cy.session, of course, also can be invalidated. This is, of course, required because you know, the access token, they don't last so long. So we need to find, or we also have to care a little bit about the invalidation as well. But that's a trivial task. And then let's come to the last one, the configuration. Of course, we can't leave it like this, what we have now. If we take a look at our Playwright login, we see that we have here the URL hard-coded, of course, the username, the password. If we run this in a testing environment, it will definitely maybe be another credentials. So we have to provide some customization for that. The way how this works, we say we have the login parameters. This is an interface that says, okay, if you want to run me, then give me the username, the password, tell me if I should run in headless mode. And of course, I also need the URL. So these are the params that I need to set inside of my login method. So I say this is the login parameters. And since I need every one of them, I can use destructuring. So I say, I need the username, I need the password, I want to know if you should run headless or not, and of course the URL. Then I just need to replace my static values with my variables. So username, and here the password. Done. Okay. And where do we define these values? Well, in the Cypress JSON, there should be by default. If it runs, of course, in CI or somewhere else, where we have environment variables coming from the operating system, then of course they will override them here. And I say, okay, I have an environment, and in there I have my login section or my login object. And I just say, I have a username, I have a password. I also need to define the headless, which is by default, of course, set to true. And then I just need to copy and paste whatever I have and yeah, insert it here. Login, where do we have the password? Here it is. The URL is, of course, the base URL, so we don't need to define that one explicitly. Yeah, and where do we, what's the position where we can fetch these values? Now, of course, it's in the command where we are calling the task. So this is now again our cy task. And there we have a second parameter. If the login function awaits some kind of parameters, then that's the place where we need to add that. So I say, okay, I have an object literal. I know already that the values are coming from my environment section of my login. And I say I want to access the login object from there. I'm using the spread operator because that's not it. I also need to add the URL. And in order to do that, I say this is the Cypress config base URL. I'll take it from there. Okay, maybe the wrong parenthesis. Now this looks much better. Well, let's see if it works. No. There we are. Calling init again. It will now pick the cached session, which is not what we want. Now it says new. Okay. And it's already using the new one. And if we are unsure, so if you're writing this on your own and you're unsure if the right parameters have been passed, you don't need to write the console log in the Playwright script or whatever. You just need to click here on the object and you see here all the variables. And as we see, the tests were successful and we have actually managed to implement what we wanted. Okay. So these have been the 4 steps. Do you have to use now Playwright all the time? No, there is there is light at the end of the tunnel. We know that there is an issue on GitHub where Cypress is actively working to support multi-domains So this would just be a temporary solution. The Playwright approach, as soon as you can do it in Playwright, again, in Cypress, you can drop the Playwright script and you can just do it natively. Of course, that's also possible then. Yeah, and that's everything that I had. There is, of course, further reading where you have some kind of walkthrough, some documentation about whatever I said. You also see here the repository at the end. This is already available. So you can then just try copy paste it, or if you have the need to do it on your own. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. And I think we can now start with the Q&A.